Welcome to Insight, today produced in collaboration with KCOS 13 El Paso Public Television. Today we are chatting about immigration policy from a nonprofit perspective, and we have in the studio three leaders of El Paso organizations that deal with this very issue. We have Melissa Lopez, Executive Director of the Diocesan Migrant and Refugee Services, Alberto Mesta, Branch Manager of Texas RioGrande Legal Aid, and Linda Rivas, Executive Director of Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center. They have generously agreed to share some of their experience with us. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So we come to this issue at a very interesting point in time. In the arc of American history, different migrant groups have suffered from various forms of vilification. The Germans were vilified in their time during the Revolutionary period. You had later on Italian and Irish immigrants vilified, Jewish immigrants, immigrants of various Asian countries, the Filipinos, the Japanese, the Chinese, and other communities. And now we have, again, the vilification of Hispanic, Latino immigrants that we see. And so I'd like to take that term, vilification, and separate that from the reality and talk about the lived experience of people here in the El Paso region. Let's deal with the issue of illegally crossing the border. Let's deal with the issue of families and children and DACA and all these things that we hear. And let's talk about this from a nonprofit perspective, from a community perspective. Talk about your various organizations. Linda, why don't we start with you? Let's talk about the work that you do in helping families and this community as a municipality deal with this very, very important problem.
Absolutely. Thank you for having us here. Las Americas is a 30-year-old nonprofit organization that has been dedicated to helping migrants and their families for all of these years. The mission of the organization started in asylum seekers. So the focus is forced migration, people fleeing violence. From there, we have expanded our services to include all types of immigration legal help, court representation in asylum, as well as DACA, and even all the way to citizenship and in between our family petitions, which we sometimes have some knowledge, it's more public knowledge of a spousal petition or a child being able to petition for a parent. So we do a little bit of, all of that. We just continue to push forward because we still stay very true and aligned to our mission that we want to make access to legal representation accessible. We want it to be available to people. We know that chances of winning your case in court is much more likely if you have an attorney or quality legal representation versus going at it by yourself.
So is this just a matter of ensuring that people in the United States receive legal representation?
When you see it from the perspective of we're dealing with a non-criminal issue, so there is no guaranteed right to counsel. And while you may have counsel, no one is going to provide that counsel for you at the expense of the government. So us nonprofits really have to exist to fill that gap.
So it's interesting and quite ironic. If you commit a crime, you actually have a guaranteed right to counsel. Mm-hmm. But if you come before a judge, but you have not committed a crime, you have not created a societal violation, you don't have a right to counsel. So in a sense, the person who has committed the crime has more right than the person who doesn't.
We really try and fill that gap because no one is going to pay for that representation. So that is correct. You have the right to have an attorney with you. You do not have the right for that attorney to be paid for you.
Mm-hmm. What is the role of DMRS in this constellation of services?
So like Las Americas, we were formed over 30 years ago. We were formed about the same time to address much the same issue. We were seeing a lot of Central Americans that were coming into the U.S. And so DMRS was formed in addition, in the same way that Las Americas was, to serve our immigrant population. We have grown pretty significantly over the years, and we are a larger program, one of the larger programs here in town that works with immigrants. And we're fortunate to have a free legal service program wherein we're able to provide free legal services to individuals whose income is below a certain percentage of the federal poverty guidelines. And so we help them in family-based cases. We help survivors of domestic violence and crime in seeking the benefits that they're eligible for. We also represent people before the immigration court, so those people going through the deportation process. We also have a couple of programs that allow us to go into the detention centers, both for the adults as well as the child detention centers that are located in this city, to provide them with information. So we're able to give them a Know Your Rights presentation. We're able to meet with them one-on-one to discern if they have any legal relief that they might be eligible for, and to try and refer them to an attorney, whether it be in-house through our organization or an attorney in the community that's willing to help them on a pro bono basis.
Alberto, Mesta, how does the Texas RioGrande legal aid figure into this calculus?
We're a traditional legal aid program, which means that we provide free legal representation for indigent individuals in basically all civil matters. As Melissa said, in the United States, there's a right to counsel at government expense when you commit a crime, but in most other civil matters, there is no government paid attorney. And many times the consequences are great. If you get evicted because you complain about roaches in your house, you might be homeless with the kids, or you applied for a job and you get discriminated against because of your sex, gender, whatever. That may mean that you don't have enough money for the next paycheck. So we try to fill a gap in basically all civil matters. We have attorneys in our program, which is the third largest legal aid program in the United States, and it's concentrated against the U.S.-Mexico border. We have 14 offices, and about 5 of those counties are the 10 poorest counties in the United States. So there's a tremendous demand for legal services because indigent people aren't going to have the ability to pay an attorney $1,000, $2,000 in most cases, whether it be a landlord-tenant eviction or immigration cases, because they're either the very poor or the working poor. So we try to fill in the gap.
So there are 2 aspects that all of your organizations have in common. One is representation before the court. Mm-hmm. And the second piece is a voice very often that is expressing itself in Spanish in a court system that is English-based. Mm-hmm. So those 2 aspects are in common, and you come from different backgrounds, different traditions, different origins, but in those 2 areas, the whole idea of representation in front of a court, that's a distinctly American value. Mm-hmm. It's embedded from our earliest history. And that everyone should have a voice, that is also embedded in our values. So that shouldn't be controversial, should it?
I hear it often, the idea that, well, you came illegally, right? Their word, not mine. You came illegally, so you don't deserve to have anybody representing you. But that's, as you said, very un-American in a lot of ways, because that's very fundamental to who we are as Americans and why this country was founded in the first place, because people's opinions and people's thoughts were being stifled back in Britain. So we came this way for that reason, and now we don't want those people because they don't speak the right language, they're not from the right country, they don't look the right way to have a voice.
Provide an example from your casework of where someone was swept up and they're in front of the court. Provide an example of where such a defense was successful.
We just this summer had a really good success in court where we were able to win asylum for a police officer from El Salvador who had suffered numerous threats to his life and the life of his wife and his children. If there was a particular person who was a support system for him here in this country, and they were seeking an attorney for, through the private defense bar, through other, people that could potentially defend him, they couldn't find it because we have very harsh courts here too when it comes to asylum asylum approval. So we took a chance on the case. We took the case, we tried it, and we won the case. And the best feeling about that, and this is not, unfortunately, I wish I could say that this was common, but it's very hard to win an asylum case in this particular El Paso region with our judges. But the feeling of this man who had been threatened and then separated from his family throughout the duration, he was separated and detained. His family was in California, and for him to finally be able to have won asylum and reunite with his family, I think was probably such a special moment for him that he had even forgotten that he had won asylum and was on his way to become a resident. It was that reuniting with the family, what our system does right now in an effort to deter this type of migration, even though it's forced migration, even though people are coming to save their lives, the deterrence of separating the family. Now we're even hearing of children who are being separated, even with a single parent who's coming through.
Does America have the responsibility to save the lives of people who would otherwise die if they did not find residence in the United States?
I believe our asylum laws support the protection of certain, if you fit within the definition of a refugee. So the persecution is happening because of what we consider a protective ground through our laws and through international law as well.
Talk about another example of someone who comes here but is not under threat.
So we had, I had a client a few years ago. She had entered on a visa. Her parents had brought her in on a visa when she was very young. And she had been living in the U.S. for many, many years. She eventually did get caught. By the time she was caught by immigration, she had had a child. Her child was born with a very severe case of cerebral palsy. He was quadriplegic. He used a G-tube for feeding. I mean, this child was born incredibly sick. When he was born, his mother was told he would live only to the age of 4, if she was lucky. By the time that we started representing her, her case had been ongoing in the El Paso Immigration Court for about 4 years. And I worked on the case for an additional 6. So after 10 years, we were able to finally get her immigration status. Her case was incredibly complicated because there had been an incident where her grandmother was dying, and because of the severe nature of her son's medical condition, he spent every waking minute of every single day with her because she was the only one that knew how to ensure that his breathing tube didn't fall out and that he had, adequate medical care at all times. And so she took her child with her to go visit her dying grandmother in Mexico, and didn't realize that she had forgotten her visa while she was there. And so while she's there, her son gets very sick, needs to be brought to an emergency room. She tries to cross the bridge and realizes she doesn't have her visa, makes, the bad choice of saying she's a United States citizen because she was desperate to get her child back in the U.S. to get emergency medical care. And that's how the whole process started. And so it was a really complicated legal case. But after 10 years of fighting her case, she was finally able to get her residency. Her son is now 16 or 17 years old. So he defied the medical odds, and his mother defied the immigration odds because the type of relief that we were able to get for her, which is cancellation of removal for non-permanent residents, like asylum, is very rarely granted. And so we were able to obtain that legal relief for her. But I'm pretty confident in saying that had she not had legal representation, that her case would surely have been denied because it was incredibly complicated.
Now, her child was born in the United States.
Yes, he was a U.S. citizen.
And the reason that the case fell in your favor was that it was a combination that he was born in the United States and that he required a constant caregiver.
That's correct. And, unfortunately, in that particular form of relief, you pretty much have to have a child almost as sick as her child was, right, in order to benefit in that way. And that's a sad thing for us when you think about the fact that, as an immigration attorney, I have somebody come in my office and, I ask them, well, how long have you been living here? Oh, okay, more than 10 years. Great. How are your children? And they tell me that they're healthy. And as an immigration attorney, I'm like, oh man, that's not good. That's, but that's the world that we live in. That's the way that our immigration laws are written. They're not written in any way to take into account humanitarian factors. They're very much written with very strict requirements that often don't even allow officers or judges to take into account those humanitarian factors until certain other things are met.
Alberto, do you have an example that stands out in your mind from your practice?
Well, there's a case I have right now where growers in Texas imported H2A workers to shear sheep that produces merino wool, and under it's supposed to be considered agriculture. So these workers applied and got visas to come and work in the United States for about a couple of months. However, once they were here, it turns out the shearing season only lasts maybe 2-3 weeks in the spring and the fall. And what the employers did, or these ranchers, they started having them build fences in really rural mountainous areas of West Texas, which is not proper under the H2A program.
So they came, the ranchers brought these workers in, specialists who could shear sheep at a higher wage rate, one assumes.
No, they get paid the prevailing rate, which means what happened is the growers have to advertise the job in the United States to attract U.S.-based workers. But many times they don't really do a good job of advertising the jobs in order to have a pretext saying that nobody apply locally so that can import guest workers,
right,
H2A workers. Because many times the H2A workers, because they're from another country, they might not necessarily know what their rights are under U.S. law, which applies to them even though that they're just here in visas. So the growers, and this is a program that's now very prevalent across the United States, they come in with a promise of good jobs, of paying the prevailing rate, that they're going to get housing, but in turn, have them do something that's not proper under the H2A program, which is doing fence work, which is you can come in with another visa, but it's going to be a higher rate. And these workers were exploited by having them pay all their visa charges, which are supposed to be paid by the employer, having them pay $500 for the clippers, the shears, which is supposed to be paid by the employer, having them put them in really bad housing in the middle of nowhere where there's no running water, no bathroom facilities. And then with all the charges they have of paying for their razors, paying them to having them get a kickback to be able to apply for the visa, then they're almost making barely above the minimum wage. And then because they're in the middle of nowhere, it's really hard for them to access or complain to somebody because they're out in shearing a sheep, which is 100 miles away from where they're used to, and they don't know the lay of the land. So we came in and filed a lawsuit against all these employers, saying that they were abusing the H2A program and abusing the workers. So even though they're not U.S. citizens, they're not LPR, they're guest workers under the program, they still have the rights and responsibilities. And we believe that that they should have the terms and conditions of that contract must be respected on it, especially now that again with the whole immigration frenzy where now the undocumented labor pool is drying up because the current policies are making it much harder for people to immigrate. If they're going to use this sort of legal immigration to come in, people have to realize that there's also subject to a lot of abuses of workers, and that sometimes the offer of employment creates a lot of exploitation of the workers, even though they're here legally into the United States.
What is the solution to these various issues that we're facing? Do we have an attitudinal shift? Do we have a shift in the legal framework in which we are inviting guest workers and others into this country, asylum seekers? What do you see as the required change to make this situation better and to reduce costs in the court, reduce time wasted and friction in the system, reduce injustice?
I think there's both of those things are needed. I think, our immigration laws are very antiquated. They're based on immigration trends from the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And so they don't account for the increase in world population and the increase in the number of people wanting to come to the United States. So I think it does require a change in law. In 1996, under President Bill Clinton, there was a major change in law, and a lot of those humanitarian aspects were taken out. And so I think some of those things need to be put back in. Immigration judges need to be given the authority to consider humanitarian factors when they're looking at these cases. And so just because we have laws doesn't mean that they're just laws and that they're the right way to be. After we didn't learn enough from the Holocaust, we then had Japanese internment camps after that, where we rounded up many Japanese and put them into camps. I mean, we created the situation that was happening in Eastern Europe. We created it again.
And before that, Chinese labor camps,
Yeah.
and then deportations.
And so I think I think we have to take a step back and realize that we can't sit in judgment of other people without first looking at our own policies, our own laws, and determining, whether or not we're on the right side of things. And I think in a lot of ways, the reason our immigration problem has grown to the point that it is right now is that, again, the preference is for European immigrants. We have a lot more, Asian immigrants and Hispanic and Latin immigrants that are wanting to come to the U.S., but they're severely limited in favor of immigration from Europe. If you're from Europe, a country in Europe, you don't even have to have a visa to enter the United States. All you have to do is have a valid European passport and you can enter the United States without a visa. And yet Canadians can walk across the border. There's not a wall on the northern border, but Canadians can walk across the border without any problem. And yet on the southern border, we have fencing already. There's talk of additional fencing, and we severely limit immigration from our Latin American countries. And so if you don't see those, if those things don't raise some red flags in terms of justice and not discriminating against certain populations, I mean.
So what you're saying is really interesting. It's the whole idea of context, where you say that the laws have actually been shaped in certain ways so that they are embedding distinctions that are based on where you come from, what your race is, and you see this disparity in people where people are treated differently.
Right.
And there is no, for example, test to see whether you have certain skills before you get a visa in certain cases. And in other cases, there is also no test, but there's a barrier in one and not a barrier in the other.
That's correct.
What you're saying is that the laws were actually applied equally and shaped so that they could be applied equally. They would have a different character and they would be executed in a different way.
Yes, and I think that's why we often talk about, we talk, racial profiling is allowed in immigration enforcement. So a Border Patrol agent can say, I pulled over this person because they're Hispanic, because they look like they may have just crossed the border. And so that's allowed in our the way that the laws are currently written and the way that our system currently works. And so, yes, I do think that if we had a system that treated everybody more fairly, you would see more immigration from the Latin countries and perhaps less immigration from the European countries, but you wouldn't have some of those discriminatory tactics that would be embedded in the way that our immigration
So
laws
that's
are.
interesting. It's an interesting framing because there you shift. You basically say, this is where we can find common ground between the various sides of this debate. If we can end up with laws that can be applied to people, no matter where they come from, in a common way, that does not take reference to which border someone crosses or what complexion one has, but instead everybody is treated in a reasonable way, then at least the argument can be made. And you can argue that the tests or whatever those colorblind tests are, that they might be correct or not correct, but at least we're talking about a level playing field as opposed to one that embeds within the law. And that means that if discrimination is embedded within the law, then some people will automatically violate it and some people will automatically not violate it, but the conduct can be identical.
Right.
What is the solution for this country?
In terms of solutions, I think we can look at DACA as what was really meant to be a short-term and temporary solution for children who were brought by their parents before they turned, the age of 15. And now we have DACA that was abruptly terminated, this September by the current administration. When you look at what DACA created, it created the ability for thousands upon thousands of formerly undocumented, brought as children, immigrants, the ability to work and not beyond work, to have a little bit of confidence in being able to come out of the shadows, to be able to continue and further their education, apply for scholarships, have the ability to, when we're on the border, we're surrounded by checkpoints. So oftentimes I will even have a potential DACA recipient who had never been able to travel for soccer, or who had never been able to travel outside of, El Paso, and DACA provided the opportunity for them to do that. And we see now, as the program is ending, it's coming to an end, and should Congress not act on creating something more permanent for the DACA eligible, and perhaps expanding who is eligible for this type of benefit, we're about to lose teachers, we're about to lose doctors, we're about to lose many people in this workforce that was DACA. So we also have to remember who's already here, and how are they continuously contributing to us as a community, and how and why we should protect them. At some point, I always try and correct in myself and my own terminology when we say immigrants. I say people. We're a community. They are a community. These are people that I went to high school with. At that time, if I'm a high school senior, I didn't know that they were undocumented. They themselves may not have known they were undocumented. So when we talk about solutions, we have to remember that we're all human beings.
I'd like to thank you all for engaging in this very vigorous conversation on this very fraught issue, a very complex issue, but there are solutions. There are ways to approach this that bridges this sort of left-right divide that can create a solution that is uniquely American, that comes out of compromise, but while retaining our integrity as a nation and honoring our laws. I'd like to thank Melissa Lopez of the Diocesan Migrant and Refugee Services, Alberto Mesta of the Texas RioGrande Legal Aid, and Linda Rivas, Executive Director of Las Americas Immigrant Advocacy Center. Thank you all
Thank you.
No, thank
for
you.
participating, and thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.